So
Okay. Okay, good.
my
So,
name,
Robyn.
my name is Robynne Anderson, and I have the great pleasure of coordinating the private sector mechanism at the UN Committee on Food Security, which is a large advocate for soil health during the Food Systems Summit, and am from a farm in Canada where we farm on black soil types.
Wow, black soil, extremely rare. Looking forward to hearing more about that. Thank you, Robyn. Paul, welcome. I know you're going to make some remarks in French, so over to you to tell us about yourself and what you do.
Oui, c'est juste pour faire un petit peu de vacances à ceux qui traduisent, pour qu'ils passent changer de langue. Donc, je me permets de parler en français, si vous le permettez. Je suis Paul
I
Lu.
will be
Je
speaking
suis secrétaire
French
exécutif
if
de
you
l'Initiative
allow
4 pour
me.
1000.
I'm Paul
L'Initiative 4
Lu,
pour 1000 est une
Executive
initiative qui est née à la
Secretary
COP21 à
at
Paris
the
en
4
2015
per Mill
et qui a pour
initiative.
principal
It
objectif
stemmed from
de
COP21
promouvoir la
in
séquestration
Paris,
du
and the
carbone dans le
main
sol pour lutter contre le
objective
changement
is to
climatique, aider
promote
l'agriculture à s'adapter au
carbon
changement des
capture in
enclos
soils
et
to
à
fight
lutter contre
against
l'insécurité
climate
alimentaire. On
change.
pourra en parler
And
plus longuement
it
tout à l'heure.
is there also to encourage food security and to help food security. But we can come back to that later, of course.
Just waiting for the translation to catch up with me. Thank you so much. Stefania, tell us about yourself and OP2B.
Yes. So hello, everyone. I'm Stefania Avanzini, and I represent a member coalition called One Planet Business for Biodiversity, who was launched in 2019 out of the One Planet Lab from the French presidency. And so we are a member coalition of 26 multinational companies that aim to restore and regenerate biodiversity. Our focus is on agriculture. And so our mission is to improve agricultural biodiversity by scaling up regenerative agriculture.
Great, thank you. So, lots of expertise here. Let's try and take some questions from the audience a bit later as well. What I've asked our panel to do is to make some opening comments each on the talking points we agreed, which I mentioned earlier. So, Robyn, let me come back to you, I guess, to start with. What are your opening comments on some of the talking points we put together here? Particularly, I guess if we start around how existing coalitions are evolving, because there's been a lot of activity in the last 3 or 4 years. It's quite hard to keep up with what's happening. So, love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. There's so many great things going on right now. And one of them is, of course, the Global Soil Partnership. And we heard from Ronald at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization earlier today. And there's lots of work there that we can all lean into, including on December 5th as World Soils Day. But a more recent activity has also come out of the Food Systems Summit, which is the Coalition for Action on Soil Health, called CASH for short. And that group is really pushing towards COP27 and the goal of specifically having the UN climate change negotiations have a resolution specifically on soils, because we know that it is, as Paul said, a vital source of carbon sequestration to tackle the climate change challenge. We know that we've got broader degradation issues, and what we really need is for the political agenda within these contexts to give it the same level of attention that we're seeing being placed on water and air and GHG emissions overall.
And do you see that those drivers being created by government? Do you see more interest in that now? I'm thinking recently one of the leading scientists in the US, who's at a leading university, pointed out that the US should have a Clean or Healthy Soils Act, like a Clean Air or Clean Water Act. Do you see interest in there from Canada, from the US or elsewhere around the world to create those drivers for coalitions?
Well, I think that soils are on the agenda in a nascent way compared to some of the other factors that we've been talking about. So it's really the moment that we need to push, but I think we're pushing on an open door. There is really an interest in what's happening. I think we have a deeper appreciation for the complexity of the soil microbiome. And I think we can talk a little bit later about some of the experiences in Canada around conservation tillage and some of the things that we've been doing for more than 30 years on this and those successes. But the political agenda isn't quite there. So we'll need all of us who are here today to leave very mobilized heading into November and the Egyptian negotiations if we really want to see soils land at something like the COP.
Yeah, there's a lot of joining up to do, isn't there? Through my Innovation Forum business, we held a webinar recently with hundreds of people about soil health in the UK, and one of the supermarket representatives noted there were 64 different approaches to measuring soil carbon health. in the UK alone. I mean, that's just one part of the conversation around biodiversity and other areas. So there's a lot of coordination and collaboration to do, isn't there, to drive change. Paul, let me turn to you. In your view, same question. How are the coalitions that you regard as significant evolving now, and what perhaps could the wine industry learn from them?
Merci. En fait, les principales coalitions qui ont été citées, c'est-à-dire
The main coalitions that have been mentioned, the Global Soil Partnership, CASH, these are coalitions that came up over time. And we are beginning to really talk about soil and soil health since, 2010, and this at a larger scale. Before that, the scientists were the only one to try and explain the importance of soil and how vital it was for the planet and people on the planet. But progressively, other players have joined in, and farmers became part of that, NGOs, companies, and governments. Governments were among the last, maybe, to join the movement. But there are different types of coalitions. The Global Soil Partnership, you have states sitting around the table, NGOs, some farmer organizations, fewer companies. What's important is to bring on board all types of partners. In 2015, when we created 4 per Mill initiative, we brought in all players, and we gave each player the same weight. It's important to know that each player has a role to play in getting healthy soils. The objective is clear: healthy soils. We have tools. Putting carbon in the soil, agroecology, and we have the players who are the farmers. But all the players, business players, have to be active around the table to make it possible to get to that objective. This is what we try to do. Now, if we look at different countries, you've talked about Canada, you've talked about the UK. In France, recently, a month ago, in fact, we had a big meeting to try and bring together all the different stakeholders, and that was the challenges of agroecology, and they focused on the tools that make it possible to reach the objective. Then you have different practices, of course. What we're interested in today is how all the players can work together, collaborate together to create synergies rather than working in isolation. An event such as this event organized by a major company who wants to bring a brick in the overall construction, this is great. What the FAO does, it's within the framework of the UN. What we do is more with civil society and NGOs. So we each have a role to play, and we should not forget the farmers, because the farmers are at the heart of everything. They'll be doing the job at the end of the day. We're here to talk, but they're there to do the carbon capture at the level of the soil.
There's an explosion of activity at the moment. It's hard to keep up, as we said. Is there a role for the European Union here to try and coordinate all of this work? Because there's some amazing work happening here in France, there's great work happening in Germany. It's quite hard to join the dots between ministries of agriculture and all the associated organisations. Is there an EU role here? I mean, the EU plays a key role in lots of other areas of environmental policy. What are your thoughts?
L'Union européenne a un rôle à jouer dans l'Union européenne. Déjà,
the EU has a role to play within the framework of EU, yes, coordinating everything that is done in the 25 countries. It has a political role that is important, setting a framework for all these actions to make sure it doesn't go in all directions. In the former roundtable, I was struck by something. We talked about regenerative agriculture. At 4 per Mill, when we understood that this term was used by big companies and big NGOs, we asked ourselves, are they talking about the same thing? If you're not talking about the same thing, you're not going to work in the same direction. So we have tried to contribute with our scientific and technical committee to try and come up with a definition of regenerative agriculture to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. And you are right. The big political coalitions like the EU, like like ECOWAS in Western Africa can play a crucial role to boost the work at the level of the national policies. It's also the role of COP with the NDCs and the national policies. They can set a framework for all the players, all the stakeholders. And these coalitions can be based on or created on a voluntary basis, but they can also be a sort of a binding organization. But the best actions are undertaken when it's on a voluntary basis, when everyone understands the role he or she can play.
Much delayed biodiversity COP not long ago in Kunming, which was much delayed due to COVID. What are your thoughts on this and how these coalitions can perhaps coalesce?
Thank you. I actually wanted to relate on, as we are quite of a young coalition, I can share some insight on why it has worked for us, because I'm representing a group of 26 companies who are actually competitors and actually have had a mindset shift and agreed on that they actually need to work together to transform the agricultural sector. And as Paolo was saying, quite importantly, the first step is alignment. So there has been an alignment on a shared definition, on a shared purpose, on a common problem. And I think that's one of the key insights that's important to say. And then we also need to understand, I think there's a paradox. Collaborations among actors, this takes time. And we don't have time, but on the other side, we need to build trust and work together. And there is an incompressible time limit that is there, that for me is quite important. And I wanted to refer also something back that you were saying. I see one of the limiting factors that I see is also the power dynamic, because we also feel farmers need to be part of the table, but I'm asking myself, there is a clear power dynamic when you have a multinational like Nestlé, and on the other side, a small farmers organization. And so I was wondering, Paul, how you were managing actually also power dynamics within your circle, because that's for me clearly a limit.
Yes, vitally important. Paul, would you care to comment on that?
Oui, évidemment, c'est la concertation est le mot-clé. Bien évidemment, c'est pas toujours simple d'avoir tous les acteurs.
Yes, consultation is crucial. It's not easy to have all the players around the table. But first of all, you have to invite them. That's the first thing. Then exchange, give them the floor to all of them, and share the documents that will make it possible for each one to find his place. Now, this is something we do at the global and local level, and it's important to inform. Because, once again, things are not binding. Everything rests on will. We work a lot with farmers' organizations, and they already work with business partners like companies. And we've seen that the companies have become aware of soil health, and they ask themselves how we can work with the whole value chain and make sure that the farmers can survive and even, live well. Now, since the beginning of this conference, we've talked a lot about traditional agriculture and the way things had evolved. When we think about this, well, scientists started showing us the way, on bringing in fertilizers, this is how it all started after the war, in a way. And this has made it possible to get to a specific agricultural model. And today, with agroecology, well, in fact, we see that the farming practices come from the farmer's experience. And here the scientists have a role that is slightly different: support. So the companies have to work with the scientists, but also with the farmers who have the experience and who share their experience. So the whole difficulty is in this dialogue. A dialogue, it has to become a constructive dialogue, because the experience comes from the field. It's not a top-down.
Stefania, you talked about alignment, incredibly challenging. I work with the Sustainable Wine Roundtable, which is 60 wine businesses from around the world, from retail to producer to distribution, and we've spent a year just getting aligned, having got set up, and it takes an incredibly long time. Do your members get frustrated as businesses who want change at the pace of change, and how do you keep them in line with the coordination you're trying to do with other organizations, because you've got some very big companies in your coalition, and I work with some of them like Nestle on regenerative ag, and when Nestle do something, they do it fast and they do it very professionally. It must be difficult for you to manage that dynamic of coalitions. How do you do that?
That's a very good question. Definitely in coalitions there are different dynamics, and there are actors that go faster than others. In our coalition, we have, as we are also CEO-led, we have actually taken the choice to go to run with the fastest ones. So we acknowledge that some are behind and will catch up later. And for example, we have published a year ago at the IUCN a regenerative agricultural framework, and the 26 companies have aligned on 8 high-level indicators. So we have aligned on impact indicators, but not on the how-tos. So actually, each company can then go also at his own pace. But
so you're aligning baselines at the
yes.
moment.
Yes, we are measuring baselines, and they have all committed with they have individual commitments on the pace that they want to go, and definitely some companies will go faster than others.
Okay.
But the objective is progression, and
Right.
and of course then also inviting inviting also the whole sector to join them.
So it sounds like quite an iterative process. Do you have any big goals for 2030 or beyond that you're trying to get the members to align around, or is it more about working out the direction of travel as you go?
It's more of a pragmatic approach of working out the direction of travels as we want to go. But clearly, I actually just joined 2 weeks ago. This is one of the questions I would love to see with my members in this fall is, can we also then align on some bold targets also to achieve by 2030?
Well, look, it's very complicated. Carbon is one thing, GHGs are another thing, farmer incomes are another thing, but biodiversity, wow, I mean, where does it end? I can understand that. Very interesting. Well, let's talk about what constitutes effective collaboration. Robynne, over to you on that. Perhaps we can talk about some examples. The word gets used a lot. What does it actually mean in practice?
Well, let me use a very soil-related example. In Canada, using farmers as an example. In the 1990s, we had an issue in Canada with the heavy soil erosion. It actually goes all the way back to the 1930s. You probably heard about the Dust Bowl of the prairies, beautiful black soils, but they're blowing across the landscape. And that soil erosion issue was very real for farmers, very textured, very pragmatic. And if you want to get people excited and motivated about soils, farmers are very motivated about soils. And, you know, there's this sort of sense sometimes when we talk about this that farmers aren't interested. But in fact, in Canada, without a piece of legislation or a single regulation, farmers said, this issue is a problem for us. And farmers' organizations all over the country said, we need to change our seeding practices. And in fact, some innovators developed a direct seeding process that allowed you to plant directly into the stubble of the prior crop, which gave us conservation tillage, which reduced the soil erosion problem. And then next we noticed, oh, well, but we're also getting really good soil tilth and really good soil organic matter. So for 30 years, we've converted almost 90% of Western Canadian farms into conservation tillage. To put that in perspective, that's probably more than, I would ballpark, half the size of Europe has moved to this kind of process without needing anything other than their ability to be motivated by this, their ability to work together, great innovators and great scientists. Now, if we can take half of that and put that into putting together some global structure by getting some people involved and engaged who haven't been as motivated on this issue, we could really actually begin to move the bar. And I think Stefania really raised this issue of outcomes. Like, how do we get focused on outcomes? Because we're just focused on, well, you have to do it my way. We're not going to have coalitions that are very effective because my way might not apply in somebody else's circumstance. So getting on with, we want to tackle erosion, we want to tackle soil organic matter, we want to tackle GHG emissions, these kinds of things, I think we can all agree on. And let's get focused on those and then look at the tactics that are deployed locally to actually achieve that.
Yes, absolutely. So what would your advice be to the wine sector from what you've learned in driving collaboration and particularly focusing on outcomes?
Well, I think the wine sector can teach all of agriculture quite a lot about the value of terroir and the value of soils. I think intercropping is probably the most critical issue. You know, getting coverage on that soil, including in between the rows, in a way that allows you to still be productive, but you're keeping that soil microbiome alive and you're keeping that soil covered to protect moisture and protect from erosion has to be absolutely critical.
Great, thank you. Paul, coming back to you with the same question I asked to Robyn. Effective collaboration, what are the best examples you've seen that are perhaps coming towards some level of scale? Because it's very easy to have a pilot project and take some nice photographs, but it's that question of getting it up there, as Robyn was saying, to a larger scale. What are your thoughts?
Alors c'est vrai que avoir un pilote et puis changer d'échelle, c'est pas la même chose. Ça peut marcher.
It's true to have a pilot and then change scales is not the same thing. Things can work on a small scale, but not a large scale. With the 4 per thousand initiative, what we've tried to do is after a few months of setting up the governance of this initiative, our objective was to have a common strategy, to share something. This 2050 strategy was decided in 2020 and regroups the 24 objectives which we feel are the most important to deploy. This covers all of the important subjects that need to be taken into account to improve soils, to improve the quantity of carbon in the soil. Afterwards, with work groups set up per objective, we have a plan for the implementation. This includes 142 activities. Now, on the basis of this reference document, which was validated by all of the people around the table, is that each one must find his her place with regards to the role they are going to play, take on 2, 3, 4 objectives and say, okay, as a company, as a scientist, as a farmer, I'm going to contribute to this in a non-isolated manner. I'm going to work by creating coalitions, small partnerships. We, at the 4 per thousand initiative, we're a small group, 6 people. We want to group together the results, create a dashboard, and say, okay, this is the progress that we have achieved collectively. This dashboard will be the dashboard of the soil's health. This is the way we see things. This is the way we want to advance together, putting everyone around the table, everyone working together, and not leave anyone behind. Secondly, with regards to the wine and vine sector, you're lucky because you have a sector which is significant in terms of the relationship between the culture, the pleasure offered by what is consumed, and that French concept of terroir, which cannot be translated. It refers to the land, to the soil, in fact. What's important is to change practices. We spoke of this earlier. How can we bring the farmers to cover their soil, whereas for years it was naked, if you like. But if it wasn't naked, it was considered to be neglected, not maintained. You know, this field has weeds, etc. Well, today there are no weeds, of course. And what we're going to do is say that there are lots of things which can help the cultivation of the vine without being in competition, while enhancing the health of the soils, reducing pesticides, etc. At the vitivinicultural sector level, you're lucky because you work with people who are responsible for the entire process, from the growing of the grapes to the production of the wine to the sale. Otherwise, you have the big maison which established the link with the wine grower. So I think that things can go very quickly here if you have the right indicators and if they're correctly monitored. I think we can motivate everyone. As soon as the farmers have understood that you have less inputs, less work, less chemicals, etc., and you get the same yield with the right quality, then they'll understand, of course.
We might call carbon cooperatives. I mean, if I think about the wine sector, the cooperatives have been quite successful, particularly in France. But if you want to get the benefits of carbon in soil, and if you want to access the future carbon market, farmers have to be bundled together because it's just too expensive otherwise. And the model of cooperatives seems like an interesting way to do that. So do you see a future of carbon cooperatives, Paul, where 5,000 hectares could have carbon credits on the market and payments to farmers rather than trying to do it all individually? Is that a pipe dream or is that something that's possible in the next 5 years?
Le petit problème qu'on a avec le mot coopérative en France et dans beaucoup d'autres pays, c'est que...
The problem we have with the word cooperative in France and in other countries tends to bring to mind certain production approaches which have not always been successful. What I understand, though, here with your question is bringing people together to be stronger. And I think what's really important is that to understand is the farmer has production costs, he has constraints, and he has to sell a product. You shouldn't consider that because we have paid him for the carbon, this will be a substitute for part of the price of his product. No, we need to take into account the production costs, his quality of life, that of his family and himself. If the farmer stocks carbon for the good of society, okay, that carbon must be paid for in addition to the purchase price of his products through public funds, for example. We spoke of the European Union early and the Common Agricultural Policy. But we also must find money from the private sector for carbon compensation. And in this case, it would be interesting to group people together so that they benefit from this. But for that purpose, it means everybody has to have the same type of practice. The practice has to be comparable. That is, say, if someone is storing more carbon and being paid a certain sum, and someone storing less and being paid the same amount, that wouldn't be right.
I think we mentioned Nestle earlier. I'm thinking of an example of Nestle. They've recently launched a pea protein milk called Wonder, and some of the peas in that milk come from cover crops in vineyards. So there's a really interesting, and it's a sustainable product as a dairy alternative. And I think that's a really interesting example of where we can see collaboration between a large food company getting its product from a vineyard, which is then sequestering carbon or fixing nitrogen. So some really interesting collaborations are out there as we see innovations take place. Stefania, let me ask you about the landscape approach. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the landscape approach, in other areas of agriculture, it's seen as the way to do things like preventing deforestation, enhancing nature. It's a multi-commodity landscape or jurisdictional approach to change where an area has a defined boundary and multiple commodity companies who are sourcing and farmers and governments work together to raise standards. Is that something you're talking about with your members? Because it's being used initially as quite a defensive thing to say, okay, in this area, we're not going to do these things. We're not going to cut down forest. We're not going to, but there's a great opportunity to turn that around and say, here's the carrot for successful regional development. Because if one region does it, the region next to them wants to do it. So that's a bit of background on landscapes. What are your thoughts on how that can apply for what we're talking about here?
Thank you for asking. Some of our most experienced members have adopted this approach. So this is really an integrated approach where you look at in which ecosystems you need to regenerate and which ecosystems maybe need to be intact. And so as a coalition, we have actually developed and will be releasing this year a decision-making tool also for companies to understand, based on the intactness and the integrity of the landscape, which approach they should take. But then just more concretely, it also for vineyards, it's quite interesting because we look at how can you replant trees on the borders of the vineyard or within the vineyard. We have talked about couloir, but also how can you work with the forests who are around it, who can bring shade, who can then bring rain. And so it is a more integrated approach. and this approach definitely requires a radical collaboration, because you're not the owner of all the lands that you're actually asking to work with. So there is a radical collaboration with governments to really have a shared management then of the landscape. And here maybe I can cite one concrete examples, also talking about cover crops. In our coalition, we're still at the blueprint projects, but we have launched a big project in north of France with 16,000 hectares and 6 companies involved, and this is about crop rotation. So we are supporting 100 farmers in their transition towards reg-ag, and different companies have then committed to buy then the crop on a long term. So we have wheat for Nestle, then we have potatoes from McCain, and then we have beetroot for sugar and for alcohol for Danone, Mondelez, and L'Occitane and L'Oréal. And so here there are many companies that have come together for a blueprint project to really see how they can support and to transform the agricultural sector.
That's a great example.
I just want also to stress maybe the mindset shift here when we talk about farmers. A farmer doesn't have one field for Nestle, one field for McCain, and one for Danone. And this is something companies need to realize, that if there is not an alignment on a framework, on impact indicators, and also on the way of working and co-financing it together, which is happening in this initiative, transition won't happen, because the farmer cannot respond to the specific needs of each company. And so that's what these companies have agreed on and aligned.
And of course, that all starts with traceability, which is not finished yet. There's a lot more to do. That example you just cited sounds fascinating. Is that on your website? Where can we read more about that?
It's going to be launched, so it's not yet on my website. It's and a good example I want to share. This project has been incubated for the past 18 months. So peer collaboration projects take time, and especially also interesting. This has been set as a prototype, but here was also thinking when you have those large transformations, is what are the incentives that the region or the European Union finally can contribute. And the project at the beginning was looking at local incentives, and then actually came back to the carbon market, and will have actually European incentives thanks to the carbon market. So that's how it's going to be partly co-financed.
Okay, very interesting. I'd like to ask all three of you, before we move into the final part, for your thoughts on the potential of what we call insetting. And insetting is, for those of you who aren't aware, it's where you tackle unavoidable carbon emissions in your own value chain. So if you're a wine retailer, your carbon offsets would go into vineyards in your value chain. They would be an inset, not an offset. And from what I understand of the development of the GHG protocol, the flag guidance, the work being done by the World Resources Institute, there's going to be a huge push towards getting companies to inset impacts in the supply chain, not planting trees somewhere else. Robynne, what are your thoughts on this? Is there potential there for the wine sector and other sectors that you see?
I think there's potential for the whole of the agriculture sector. And in fact, actually for about 15 years now, parts of the agriculture sector have been selling carbon credits to other sectors, including aviation. And here we are faced with this huge reputational challenge for agriculture, which is actually contributing positively in several cases, but now to other industries. So I think job one in the agri-food sector is insetting to get agriculture to net zero, and then we have the ability to be positive. Very few sectors have the ability to be net positive, but we need to sort that out inside our own value chain first, and then start selling it to others, in my opinion.
And should it be just carbon? Because a lot of companies I talk to are quite concerned about the rush to net zero, net positive, because in business, if you focus on one goal, that has serious unintended consequences, and other things can cause problems in the race to carbon. And I wondered what the three of you think about the idea of just focusing more on nature. You know, nature needs half biodiversity, rather than this narrow goal of just, in many cases, simply carbon dioxide, which can often even neglect methane, for example. So I'd be interested in all of your views on that. Let's start with you, Robynne, and move around.
Well, I'm sure Stefania will be talking about the nature goal as a whole. So without question, any singular focus is going to lead to challenges if you ignore all other consequences. But I'm more hopeful that the textured discussion that we're having now around water, around biodiversity, around nutrition will lead to more complex solutions. And I do believe that there are very concrete possible paths for agriculture to move to a net zero scenario. And I don't think we have to do it in a way that compromises all the rest of it. Crop rotation is a great example. A very old, very basic concept, great for biodiversity, great for net zero, and great for nutrition because you need a broader food basket. So there's some ways to get to multiple outcomes that are very positive. So I don't think it's either go for net zero or have to work on nature. I think that can be the same path.
The pricing structure is the challenge, isn't it? Because there's a price for carbon, but Stefania, there's not a price for nature and biodiversity yet, is there?
No, but
Paul, let me ask you in a minute what you think.
No, but I think it's also an intuition. Definitely, OP2B is for biodiversity. So we have really embraced 4 important principles, and we believe that nature, climate, and people go together. And just to say, it's about increasing biodiversity in soils. It's about water and carbon storage in soils, and it's about reducing also entrants. And last but not least, more importantly, is about improving the livelihoods of farmers. And I think for us, it's quite important as the companies to see this all goes together in a holistic approach.
So we may eventually be talking about impact insetting rather than carbon insetting. Paul, what do you think about all this? Complicated stuff, I know.
Non, c'est pas si compliqué que ça quand on y réfléchit, parce que la base de tout ce dont on a parlé, la biodiversité, le changement
Things are not as complicated as that because, the very basis, biodiversity, climate change, food safety, and the livelihood of farmers is all based on soil health. You have to start with that. Anything we can do with the principle of insetting means that, first of all, we use less tractors, so less greenhouse gases, less inputs, less nitrogen inputs, which means we'll have less nitrous N2O, in fact. And, the fact that we replant hedges and shrubs and trees. We talk about the voltaic systems, which will protect vines in the most exposed zones. And this, in fact, will protect against frost and will enable to produce electricity. Then you have to look at how you produce the solar panels, of course. But anyway, having said this, with a sector such as this one, we can be positive very quickly. We can be net positive very quickly. As was already said, agriculture is the only economic sector which has the ability to be positive in the long term. Net first and then positive. And that positiveness is going to enable us to have an impact on the other sectors. I think the gong has gone off. Well, just to conclude here, if we've tried to put this together in a work called the farmers who have who have soil in their hands. This is going to come out in English and French, 130 pages to read, not too much. If you have an idea of everything that's possible, you will find it in this book.
I'm sorry I didn't bring in questions, but there was so much to talk about. I would like to ask our panel just to give us their sort of final takeaway. So in the next, got 30 seconds each. If you want the audience here or online to remember one thing about the conversation we've been having, what is that one thing? Robynne?
We need to get soil into the conversation. So when we're talking GHG, make sure you mention soil health. And then as you're doing that in the next few months, please support this broader effort to make sure there is a resolution at the UN FCCC COP on soil health.
Resolution at COP. Great, thank you. Stefania, 30 seconds, and then Paul, 30 seconds.
Like my call to action for the vineyard is we need radical collaboration, I think, to rethink also the way we manage our ecosystems, and so in and off the fields. That would be my call to action to the audience.
In and off the fields. You guys have got some good sound bites. Paul, 30 seconds for you.
Je compléterai effectivement qu'on parle de la santé des sols dans toutes les 3 conventions des Nations Unies cette année.
I would complete by saying that we must talk about soil health in all of the major UN conferences and conventions that will take place in 2022. And I would come back to something said by a wise Indian man who said in April at a conference, if you want to tell your children, your mother, you love them, tell them to work the land, the soil.
10 seconds early, but please let's thank the panel for their fantastic contribution. Thank you all so much. What a fascinating conversation, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you all.